Hello and welcome to the Timur Podcast. Now, a quick note before we dive right into this. This is part 2 of Timur's invasion of the Kartid Dynasty episode. So if you haven't listened to part 1, it might be a little confusing. It might be a little confusing anyway because this is medieval history in Central Asia. Confusing is the name of the game. But it might be slightly less confusing if you go back and listen to part 1. Again, this is part 2 of Timur's invasion of the Kartid Dynasty. Let's just jump right back into where we left off. For 3 days, his men circled the fort and prepared for an assault. The fortress had a strong gate, walls, and many ditches that had been dug around the fort in preparation. Some of these ditches had been filled with water as well. But Timur's men had prepared. They had ladders for the walls, and they'd also constructed makeshift rafts and bridges to help them cross these ditches. So, on the 4th day of the siege, Timur ordered his men to attack. Yazdi describes the scene with this. They crossed the ditch upon planks and rafts, came to the foot of the wall, and discharged their arrows against the enemies, of whom they made a terrible slaughter. Stones and arrows fell like rain. At the same time that this assault across the ditches and against the walls was taking place, Timur had also sent men around to the gate where many defenders had gathered. And while this multi-pronged assault was taking place, we're told that Timur, although not directly engaged in the combat, was riding around the ranks of his men, shouting encouragement and mocking the enemy. And as the men saw and heard their Emir, Yazdi says, quote, "At the sight of their prince, the men were recruited with fresh vigor." So, you can picture this scene. Timurid soldiers are clamoring through ditches and stakes and moats, crossing these ditches and small moats on makeshift rafts, while others are continually firing arrows to keep the defenders off the walls. Meanwhile, other men are hastily trying to rush through the missiles and the crowds to get their ladders up against the walls. The defenders on the walls are vastly outnumbered, but their hope lies in holding these very walls. So they do everything in their power to keep the attackers at bay. Arrows and spears and rocks are hurtling through the air. The screams of excited men, wounded men, dying men, men giving orders, and through it all rides Emir Timur, shouting at his men, many of whom he probably knew by name, encouraging them to go and take the fort. At some point, amidst the chaos, we're told that Timur is actually shot with arrows twice. Now, he is unfazed, that's what armor is for, he's fine, but I did come across one scholar who theorized that it was at this battle that Timur received his wounds that would make him lame. So I thought I would mention it, but most people agree it was decades previously during his mercenary years. Anyway, the battle rages on, but the onslaught is too much for the defenders. On one portion of the wall, 4 Timurid soldiers are able to scramble up the ladders and beat back the defenders on the wall. A Timurid banner is raised, signifying that part of the wall has been taken, as more Timurids pour over the ladders. Meanwhile, at the same time, the Timurids are engaged in bloody hand-to-hand combat for the gate. At one point, the gate is forced open and the Timurids sweep in. And now that the gate is taken and the wall is breached, the Timurids pour into the fortress like a flood of ants. The organized defense disintegrates into chaos in a matter of minutes. Every defender is put to the sword. And here, after lamenting the dead Timurid soldiers who died fighting on the walls and drowning in the moats, Yazdi gives us somewhat of a chilling foreshadow. He says, "This was the first conquest they made in Iran. It was taken by our victorious soldiers at the first assault, which seemed to foretell that all of the kingdoms of the empires of Persia should in a short time be brought in subjugation to the invincible Timur." But, although this fortress had been taken, the mighty city of Herat remained. Timur's forces arrived outside the city soon thereafter and began laying waste to the surrounding suburbs, farmlands, and gardens. Inside the city, Sultan Malik prepared his people for the siege, encouraging them to withstand the coming storm and for his soldiers to fight bravely. It is now probably the late spring of 1381, and Timur's siege of Herat begins. Now, before we follow the narrative with the siege of Herat, I want to pause for a few minutes and talk briefly about the actual city of Herat. And if this is your first time listening, or since it's been a while, here's why I do this. I have never been to Herat. I have never been to most of the cities or places we'll talk about, unfortunately. And because of that, sometimes it's easy for me, and maybe us, to kind of lose perspective. The endless names of peoples or places that suffered by Timur's hands kind of lose their personality, their reality, if you will. They can lose that reality in our minds. And that's not our fault. That's just how human brains often work. It's hard for us to connect with people or places we may never have been to. But it is imperative that when we learn history, we keep that human connection with our ancestors of the past. That's what gives this all any meaning. So, with that, if you are not familiar, let me introduce you to the city of Herat. To begin, I am only going to tell you a bit of the history of Herat leading up to where we are with Timur's narrative, because it turns out that Herat is one of the most important cities in Timurid history. You could actually make a very strong case that Herat is it's even more important than Samarkand. And the reason for this is because after Timur's death, and we're still quite a bit off from that, but after Timur's death, the capital of what will be called the Timurid Empire will be Herat. So we will be talking about Herat a lot in the future, but for now, here's a very brief history up until where we are now. Herat is situated in western Afghanistan today. It has always been situated on a crossroads between India, Persia, Central Asia, and China. It is one of the more prominent cities of the famous Silk Road. The official founding date of Herat, if you will, was 500 BC, although there are parts of it that date much further back. The city really gained prominence under the Persian Empire. The so-called father of history, Herodotus, called Herat the breadbasket of Central Asia, as farming as well as industry had always been a prominent feature here. With the conquests of Alexander the Great, Herat was taken, and the famous Herat Citadel, a fortress that still stands today, was partially started and partially built by Alexander 2,300 years ago. For the next few centuries, Herat would pass between several warring peoples and factions, including the Seleucid successors of Alexander, the Parthians, the Sassanids, the Chionites, the Hephalites, and others, because of its geographical, different G word, position at this crossroads, and because of the fertile farmland and the metalworking and its strategic fortress, Herat was often a battleground. Still, though, the city prospered, and it became a diverse place with prominent Zoroastrian, pagan, Buddhist, and Nestorian Christians all living and working together. In the 650s, the Muslim Arab invasions conquered the nearby regions, and Herat was eventually taken. We're not sure of the exact date, but it's confusing because it was probably taken back by locals soon thereafter. In fact, for the next 200 years, Herat's influence passed between the now growing Muslim world and the locals who kept their Nestorian, Zoroastrian, or Buddhist traditions alive for quite a while. However, by 870 AD, though, Herat was firmly in control of Muslim powers. And this is when the city really started to expand into its golden age. As a crossroads, we're told that this medieval city had 4 giant gates, each facing a different direction. And immediately within each gate were giant marketplaces where one could find every manner of good. But Herat became especially famous for its blacksmithing and coppersmithing. One famous piece that survives from this era, circa 1163 AD, is the Bobrinsky bucket, say that 10 times fast, a copper pot that has intricate silver etchings, writings, and pictures on it. And it's still in excellent condition and is housed in a museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, that mostly sounds good, but life wasn't perfect. The city of Herat still passed between political hands. It was besieged in 1042, and sacked in 1157. But overall, it prospered. With the eastern expansion of Islam into what we would call Pakistan and India today, Herat became more like a base of operations, recruitment, and trade. The Ghorid and Ghaznavid empires controlled Herat during the 1100s and the 1200s, and this is generally regarded as Herat's golden age. In 1201, the Great Mosque of Herat began operation over an old Zoroastrian temple, and despite centuries of wars, earthquakes, and looting, most of the mosque survives today and is still a sight to behold. Further, during the Ghaznavid era, one writer said that Herat had, quote, colleges, 12,000 shops, 6,000 bathhouses, 444,000 houses, and the men are warlike and carry brilliant arms. Now, those numbers are probably exaggerations, but they give a good glimpse into the prosperity of the city nonetheless. And the tagline, or the motto of Herat, became the Pearl of Khorasan. But all things must come to an end. And as we have seen so many times in the course of this podcast, and as we'll see many more times again, this would come to an end with the Mongolian invasions. In the year 1221 AD, the armies of Genghis Khan surrounded Herat and demanded its surrender. Thankfully, the city did just that. And as is usually the case with Genghis Khan, he shows mercy to people who surrender to him without a fight. The city was still stripped of anything and everything of value, and heavy taxes were put in place, but the people were spared, and they were allowed to continue on as Mongolian subjects. Unfortunately, though, the citizens of Herat became restless under the Mongolian yoke, and they demanded the end of these huge taxation policies. They rose in rebellion shortly after the Mongols had left. Thus, the Khan returned. And this time he returned without mercy. In 1222, Herat was sacked and utterly destroyed by the Mongols. Everybody within was either enslaved or butchered. But the sources seem to hint that the majority were slaughtered. One source horrifyingly states that no head was left on a body, nor body left with a head. For the next 15 years, the ruins of the city and the mounds of the dead were left untouched. But human will can never be conquered, and in the late 1230s and early 1240s, a Tajik family began rebuilding the city with Mongolian approval. This family, or dynasty, was the Kartids, or the Karts, who had been untroublesome subjects of the Mongols, and this allowed them to bring Herat back from the ashes. For the next 140 years, the Kartids would grow Herat back into the pearl that it had once been. Maybe not quite to the same level, but still a city that would demand respect and admiration. By the mid-1300s, Herat was prospering again. But the year's 1381. Sultan Malik is within the Herat fortress, perhaps on the walls that Alexander the Great himself had constructed, but another conqueror is here on the horizon. Timur is here. Now, Sultan Malik wasn't in the worst of positions. His city was mighty. He had been preparing for this very moment for a while. The walls and the towers were strong. The main gate of the city was solid iron and thought to be impenetrable. And even Yazdi admits that Malik's soldiers were, quote, the strongest and most valiant of men of Iran. So with all of that, make Timur come to you, make him attack you, because one of the oldest military laws of nature, if you will, is that battle almost always favors the defenders. But Timur is one to bend laws on their head. He arrives at Herat in force, and his men begin pillaging the gardens and the suburbs outside of the walls, killing or capturing anybody unfortunate enough to have been left outside. And then the siege begins. Arab Shah describes it with this. Timur, however, did not think it worthwhile to fight with him, so the army surrounded him on every side and made a siege. Timur holding a safe and secure position while his enemy had exchanged open spaces for confinement. In short, Timur turned Herat from Sultan Malik's fortress into his prison. And it wasn't just Sultan Malik now trapped, it was everybody inside. We're not given an exact time frame on what happened next, but we know that problems started erupting among the defenders. First of all, the civilians were not as bloodthirsty as the soldiers. We're told that the people, both rich and poor, both Sunni and Shiite, began crying out against Sultan Malik, urging for peace, because they were afraid for their families and their homes. Further, the siege began taking its intended toll. Disease and hunger soon started spreading in the neighborhoods. This only added to the anti-war fervor that was spreading at the same rate of the germs. And finally, Sultan Malik became aware of this whole situation, so he sent out religious and military leaders to try and encourage the people, win them back into his camp, because he knew that without their support, without unity in the city, there would be no hope to hold out against Timur. Well, it doesn't go well. The people only cry out against the Sultan all the more. Their situation was desperate. This is how Arab Shah describes the dire state of affairs. The nobles and commoners were troubled, and the cattle and the beasts moved this way and that, and the town was choked with dense mobs. Both gentle and simple perished, disease consumed them, and hunger destroyed them, and the wailing and murmuring only arose. Thus, Sultan Malik decided that he had already been defeated. He now had to do what he could for his people, his family, and himself. In Timur's camp, they noticed the giant gates of the city being opened, and two figures emerged from the city and walked to Timur's army. It is Sultan Malik's own mother and one of his own sons as well. They are shown to Timur and they deliver the message that Sultan Malik is willing to surrender Herat without further bloodshed as long as Timur promises the safety of him and his family. Timur welcomes the two and responds to them that it will be as Malik wishes. Thus, in the late spring of 1381, Herat was given to Timur without much fighting. Timur and his men entered the city. Everything of value, all of the, as Yazdi puts it, treasures and riches which the kings had amassed for generations, all of that was carried back to Samarkand. The giant iron gates of the city were taken down and they were taken to Timur's home city of Kesh as war trophies. Further, the great fortresses and walls of Herat were largely destroyed and pulled down to assure that rebellion would be discouraged. Still, though, Timur honored his word. The people, although robbed and given new taxes to pay, they were allowed to live. Sultan Malik, too, along with his family, were honored, welcomed, and moved to Samarkand. But they were free in nothing but name, and although they were alive for the moment, fate had abandoned them whether they admitted it or not. During the handing over of the city, we are given an account of a short event that may have happened. One of Sultan Malik's own sons was not willing to surrender to Timur. Yazdi tells us that there was a part of a fortress where this son held out for several days until finally, at the begging of his father, he finally surrendered to Timur. But Arab Shah gives us a more exciting account. In his version, this son was hiding among the battlements as Timur rode victoriously into the city. Once in sight, the son raised a bow and arrow, aiming to snipe Timur off of the horse and liberate the city. However, as he raised the bow, he second-guessed what the ramifications of his actions would be. Arab Shah says he remembered the wise words that his father once told him, but the arrow once shot could not be brought back. Thus, he did not fire the arrow. Either way, Timur welcomed the son once he did surrender, and he was rewarded with gold and a fine saber. But, getting back to the campaign, Herat and the Kartid dynasty had been conquered by Timur. Author Hilda Hookham summarizes this nicely. She says, Herat was one of the strongest and finest cities of Khorasan, in fact, of all Ilkhanate territories. It compared with Tabriz and Baghdad, and it had fallen to Timur as easily as an autumn fruit. As I mentioned earlier, new taxes and administration was set up with Herat, but Timur's 1381 campaign was not over. So, let's go back to the BIG Persian Five. Timur had conquered Herat and the Kartid Dynasty, but, if you'll remember, before this whole debacle with Timur, Sultan Malik of the Kartids had been at war with another of the big Persian five, the Sarbadars. The Kartids and the Sarbadars had been fighting for political and religious reasons. The Kartids were primarily Sunni, while the Sarbadars were primarily Shiite, but the big point of contention was over the important city of Nishapur. So, jumping back to where we are now, Timur realized that he now had a claim to the city of Nishapur since he had just defeated Sultan Malik, who had been fighting the Sarbadars for control of Nishapur. So, his now subjects were the ones who had a claim to Nishapur, so that meant that he did. The logic of these claims isn't bulletproof or arrowproof, but then again, it didn't really have to be. For a lot of these wars and invasions, the casus belli is often, I want that land. So, Timur starts marching his vast hordes towards northern Persia and the city of Nishapur. And everybody starts panicking. The Kartids were no Mongols, but they weren't nobodies either. They had been a powerful and respectable dynasty that Timur had just vanished from political existence. So fear starts spreading like wildfire, and several rulers send Timur messages as fast as possible. The first to do this is a small warlord who I didn't include in the Big Persian Five, as he's not as important, but we will talk about him again probably next episode, so I have to mention him here. His name was Ali Beg, and he was the ruler of two cities, Kalat and Tus. Well, these cities aren't too far from Nishapur, so Ali Beg hurries over to Timur, kisses the royal carpet, and pledges his allegiance. Timur rewarded him handsomely, and that is where we will leave Ali Beg for now, he being a vassal of Timur, but allowed to rule his cities under Timur's vassalage. But another man came before Timur, and this guy was a much bigger political player. This was Ali Muayyid, leader of the Sarbadars. And if you'll remember, the Sarbadars were another of the big Persian five. They were the mostly Shiite, maybe basically robber barons, maybe religious fanatics, maybe proto-elected leaders, maybe all that together, but they controlled much of what we would call modern northern and central Iran. And Ali Muayyid was the most prominent leader of the Sarbadars. There were other rulers, it wasn't your traditional sultanate or kingdom, but he was the biggest. And he ruled from the generally regarded capital of the Sarbadars, Sabzavar. Anyway, Ali Muayyid goes to Timur's camp, announces that he is fully submitting to Timur, and that Nishapur, Sabzavar, and all Sarbadar-controlled lands will now kneel to Timur. However, while Ali Muayyid is very eager to submit to Timur, he gives Timur a request. Turns out the Sarbadars are having a real hard time with their northern neighbors, and they could use Timur's help. The northern neighbors of the Sarbadars was the third of the big Persian five that we talked about, the kingdom of Mazandaran on the southern banks of the Caspian Sea, led by an upcoming general and warlord, Amir Wali. And wow, that was a run-on sentence. Anyway, Amir Wali had been a proper thorn in the side of the Sarbadars for years, and now that the Sarbadars were Timur's subjects, well, that might be their solution to Amir Wali. So Timur agrees to help, and his army begins moving north into Mazandaran territory. In the late spring of 1381, the Timurids arrived to the city of S3Ep1, which was controlled by men loyal to Amir Wali. But as to what happens next, I'm just going to give the next paragraph to Yazdi as he describes it the best. Timur at the same time took horse to march to S3Ep1, which was in the hands of the lieutenants of Amir Wali, Prince of Mazandaran. And as soon as he had arrived there, he gave orders for dispatching the siege of this town. The soldiers had no sooner fixed their stations in the camp where they designed and prepared their machines of war. Then, hanging their bucklers on their neck, they marched forthwith to the walls, in which they made considerable breaches and entered the town. They put to sword a great number of people and destroyed all their homes, the most considerable as well as those of the poor, so that there remained to that great town only the name Aspharian, which it could not be deprived of. Thus, having given this show of force and reducing the town of Aspharian to nothing but a haunted name, Timur then sent a messenger to Amir Wali. The message was simple. If Amir Wali would travel to Timur, kiss the royal carpet, and submit, then he would be showered with more wealth and power than he could ever hope to achieve on his own. However, the message went on with, quote, "But if through his stubbornness he should refuse to appear, he would be by that means become very unfortunate." Simple and effective. Well, Amir Wali wasted no time with his response. He showered the messenger with gifts and showed him great hospitality. And then he sent back the messenger with the message that he would submit, of course, but he had to get a few things taken care of back home before he could make the actual journey. Still though, here, Timur, here, take these gifts and this tribute. I do aim to submit. It just might be a little bit of time before I can come to you. Now, that might seem a little fishy for you and me, but for the time, Timur was content with this and he turned his army homeward. They spent the summer of 1381 in the pasture lands and the hills between Khorasan and Mawarnar. His men were allowed to rest, enjoy the spoils of their victories, and celebrate their achievements. We're told that at some point during this summer, Timur killed some robbers that had killed some men of his tribe back home, but other than that, this brings Timur's first invasion of Persia to an end. He returned to Samarkand mid-1381 with nothing but victory behind him. So let's close this episode with a quick summary. Of the Big Persian Five, as we're calling them, in only a year, less than a year really, 3 of them were now dealt with. To begin, the Kartid Dynasty, centered with Sultan Malik and the city of Herat, had been conquered and absorbed. Secondly, the Sarbadar Confederacy, under the leadership of Ali Muayyad, had submitted to Timur without a fight. And thirdly, Amir Wali of Mazandaran had pledged his allegiance after hearing what Timur did to his town of Aspharian. And finally, although he's not in the Big Persian Five, the small local warlord Ali Beg, ruler of Kalat and Tus, he too had submitted to Timur, and we'll talk more about him later too. Thus, Eastern Persia had fallen under Timur's domain. But to say this land had been conquered, that would be a very big stretch. Actually, saying Timur had conquered these lands would really just be a lie. These men, these dynasties and kingdoms, these people, they had been defeated by Timur, yes, but they had not been conquered. Because conquering denotes some level of permanence, and now that Timur and his soldiers were gone, who's to say that they'll ever be coming back? What actual lasting enforcement does he still have over us? And before Timur had even returned back to Samarkand, talk of rebellion and independence were already spreading in Persia. That, though, we'll have to wait for our next episode. With that, it's time to wrap up today's content. Thank you for listening to the Timur Podcast. Next time we will follow the Prince of Destruction as he returns to the lands of Persia, as well as takes care of some things back home. If you want to support the show, you can find the podcast's Patreon page at patreon.com, that's spelled patreon.com/Timur Podcast. Any donations are very much appreciated, and thank you all who are supporting the show or who have done so in the past. If you want to reach out to me for any reason, feel free to email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Facebook or Twitter at Twitter Podcast. That is not correct, at Timur Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and for all of your encouragement that you continue to send. I really do appreciate it. And with that, I will see you on the step soon, right here on the Timur Podcast.